Have you ever wondered what secrets could be hiding at the bottom of a lake? 20 years ago, I found something beneath the surface of this water that still keeps me awake at night. A hand, pale as the moonlight, reached out to me from the depths. But when I told the others, no one believed me. They called me crazy, said I imagined it. But today, I know I wasn't wrong. Today, they found the truth. And it's worse than anything I could have imagined. 19 skeletons, all children, chained to the bottom of this lake. Who were they? How did they get there? And why was one of them trying to reach me? Stay tuned to hear the terrifying story of Camp Valleyway, a place that hides a darkness far deeper than its waters. If this story sends shivers down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel. Share this video with your friends who love a good scary story. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chilling tale. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you saw what I saw in that lake? Let's dive into this nightmare together. I still remember the first time I saw Camp Valleyway. I was 15, barely old enough to work, and desperate for a summer job to escape the monotony of my small-town life. The camp, nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills, seemed like a paradise at first glance. Surrounded by dense, towering trees and shielded by 2 steep mountains, it was the kind of place that felt completely cut off from the rest of the world. In the middle of it all was the lake, a sprawling body of water that glistened under the summer sun, its surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. But even on that first day, something about the lake unsettled me. Its water wasn't crystal clear like you'd expect. It was murky, stained reddish-brown from the southern clay. It felt alive. The camp was always bustling with activity. Every week, kids from all over the state would arrive, laughing, yelling, and dragging their oversized duffel bags behind them. As a swim instructor, I spent most of my days by the lake, teaching kids how to float, dive, and tread water. It was exhausting work, but I didn't mind. Back then, the camp felt like freedom, a break from everything I wanted to leave behind at home. But Camp Valleyway had its quirks, the kind that only reveal themselves after you've been there for a while. For one, there were the stories. Late at night, when the younger campers were asleep, the counselors would gather around the fire and trade tales about the lake. Some claimed it was bottomless. Others swore they'd heard whispers coming from the water when no one was around. One story, told in hushed tones, was about a camper who vanished years ago, their body never found. I laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to campfire folklore meant to scare new counselors. Then there were the 2 special weeks. Most of the summer, the campers were kids from wealthy families, sent to us so their parents could enjoy a vacation of their own. We called it Rich Week. But once every summer, the Clarkstown orphanage would send a group of kids to the camp free of charge. Orphan Week, we called it, though never to their faces. The dynamic shifted during those weeks. The energy was different, quieter. The kids were polite but withdrawn, as though they were used to being invisible. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to those weeks. There was something unsettling about how eager the Clarkstown staff were to unload the kids and leave. They never stuck around for the usual tour or chit-chat. And then at the end of the week, locals from the surrounding towns would show up to adopt some of the kids. It was always framed as a heartwarming event, an act of generosity from the community. But I wonder now, how many of those kids ever made it home? Back then, I didn't question any of it. I was just a kid myself, more concerned with making friends and impressing my boss. I had no idea what lay beneath the surface, both in that lake and in the camp itself. The days at Camp Valleyway followed a routine, but it was a routine that hummed with life. Mornings started with the sound of the camp bell ringing through the valley, calling everyone to breakfast in the dining hall. The scent of bacon and syrup mixed with the earthy smell of dew-covered grass as campers shuffled in, still half asleep. After breakfast, the camp broke into groups, each headed for their daily activities. Hiking, arts and crafts, archery, and of course, swimming. For me, the lake was both a workplace and a refuge. I loved watching the sunlight dance across its surface during those early hours, the fog lifting as the day heated up. Even the murkiness of the water seemed to fade under the brightness of the morning sun. But as the day stretched on, the lake began to change. The light no longer sparkled as it did in the morning. Instead, the water took on a heavy, dark sheen, almost as if it absorbed the energy from everything around it. There were times, especially when I stayed late cleaning up after swim lessons, that I swore I felt the lake watching me. It sounds ridiculous now, but I wasn't the only one who felt that way. Other counselors joked about the Valleyway curse, blaming every small mishap, the tangled fishing lines, overturned canoes, or even stubbed toes, on the lake. At night, when the wind picked up, you could hear the water lapping against the dock, a low, hollow sound that almost resembled whispers. I tried not to think about it, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. The Clarkstown orphans were always assigned to the last week of camp before the 4th of July. That year was no different. They arrived on an old, battered school bus, their faces pressed against the windows as they stared out at the camp. There was a stillness about them, a silence that felt out of place in the usually chaotic arrivals. Most of the kids stayed close to each other, shuffling down the gravel path to their cabins, their belongings packed neatly into second-hand suitcases. I remember noticing how small they looked, some barely big enough to join the swim class. Something else stuck out that year. The bus driver didn't linger. Normally, staff or parents would stick around to chat with the camp director, but not this time. The driver barely even stopped the bus. He opened the doors, waved the kids off, and was gone in a cloud of dust before anyone could ask questions. It left a strange taste in my mouth, but I didn't dwell on it. I had a busy week ahead. The orphans quickly blended into camp life, but they weren't like the other kids. They didn't complain, didn't argue, and didn't even seem that excited about the lake, which was usually a hit with everyone. Now, looking back, I wonder if they already knew what we didn't, that the lake held more than just water. I didn't know it then, but the whispers around Camp Valleyway weren't just stories. The orphans, the lake, and the uneasy silence. They were all pieces of a much darker puzzle. Why did the Clarkstown orphanage send those children here? What secrets were buried beneath the murky water? And why was everyone so desperate to ignore them? If you think this is just another campfire tale, you're wrong. What I found in that lake changed everything. If you're ready to uncover the truth, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because this story only gets darker from here. Let me know in the comments. What do you think was hiding beneath the lake? Let's dive in. It was the 5th week of camp, the middle of Orphan Week, and the hottest day of the summer. The kind of day where the air felt thick and suffocating, and even the shade offered little relief. By midday, the entire camp seemed to gravitate toward the lake. Kids splashed in the shallows, counselors lounged on the dock, and the laughter and shouts echoed off the surrounding mountains. It felt like any other summer day, until it didn't. I was helping patch a torn sail under the water sports canopy, a shaded area near the boathouse where the sailing instructors kept their gear. Logan, the head of water sports, sat across from me at a weathered picnic table, his sharp eyes scanning the lake like a hawk. Logan was a no-nonsense kind of guy, the type who demanded respect without asking for it. He had this intensity about him, as if he could sense trouble before it even started. That's why, when Ed came sprinting up from the lake, his face pale and panic-stricken, Logan didn't waste a second. "We're missing one," Ed gasped, bent over and clutching his knees. His wet hair dripped onto the dirt, forming small puddles by his feet. "One of the campers. He's not in the water. Friends don't know where he is." Logan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his whistle, a piercing shriek that cut through the humid air, silencing the lakefront in an instant. "Everyone out of the water!" he bellowed, his voice booming over the now-still lake. "All lifeguards to the dock." Adrenaline shot through me as I scrambled to follow the other lifeguards. We lined up along the edge of the dock, our training kicking in. Logan gave quick, sharp instructions, assigning each of us to a section of the swimming area. I was assigned the deepest part, where the water dropped to about 14 feet. My heart pounded as I dove into the water, the sudden chill of shock against the oppressive heat. The visibility was worse than usual. The lake's murkiness seemed to cling to me, the sunlight barely penetrating the depths. I swam slowly, my hands sweeping through the water, searching for any sign of the missing camper. My lungs burned as I pushed myself farther down, my feet brushing against the soft, silted bottom. Then I felt it. At first, it was just a light touch against my cheek, like a piece of floating debris. But when I turned my head, my blood ran cold. A hand, pale, swollen, and lifeless, drifting toward me out of the murk. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The hand was attached to an arm, and then a body, a girl, her long, dark hair fanning out around her like a halo. Her eyes were open, staring at me with a hollow, glassy emptiness. I wanted to scream, but my lungs were already begging for air. Clutching her torso, I kicked toward the surface, desperate to break free of the water's suffocating grip. Breaking the surface, I gasped for air, the girl's lifeless body heavy in my arms. The sunlight burned my eyes as I shouted, "I found her! Over here!" My voice cracked from the strain, but I didn't care. The other lifeguards turned toward me, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. But then, just as I started swimming toward the dock, I felt it. A sudden, sharp tug pulled the girl's body downward. My grip slipped, and before I could react, she was wrenched from my arms. I turned back, diving after her. But all I could see was murky water and the faint silhouette of her figure sinking farther into the darkness. It was like something below had claimed her, something stronger, something that didn't want her to leave. I kicked harder, reaching out into the void, but my lungs screamed for air. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I couldn't keep going. Reluctantly, I surfaced again, choking on water as I cried out, "She's gone. She's slipped." I treaded water frantically, scanning the lake for any sign of her, but the surface was calm, eerily undisturbed, as if nothing had happened at all. Logan's whistle cut. Through the chaos again, a sharp, commanding sound that brought everyone back to the dock. "That's enough," he barked, his voice tight with authority. "Everyone out of the water. Now!" I swam back, my limbs heavy and trembling. As I climbed onto the dock, the other lifeguards gave me wary glances. Logan was waiting for me, his face unreadable. What happened out there? He demanded. I found her, I stammered, shivering despite the heat. A girl. She was... she was already gone. But something pulled her back down. Logan's jaw tightened. His piercing eyes locked onto mine. What girl? He growled. The camper isn't missing. He was found at the restroom near his cabin. This whole thing was a false alarm. No, I insisted, my voice rising. I saw her. I touched her. She was there, right there. Logan stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. Listen to me, Mike, he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. You want to make up ghost stories. Do it on your own time. You scared half the camp with your nonsense, and if you ever pull something like this again, you're done here. Got it. But I'm not lying. I protested, my voice breaking. I know what I saw. He didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, blowing his whistle again to signal the end of the search. The other lifeguards avoided my gaze as they filed off the dock, muttering among themselves. I stood there alone, staring out at the lake. It looked so calm now, its surface glinting under the sun like nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was down there, something dark, and it wasn't letting go. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the image of the girl's pale, lifeless face. Her hollow eyes seemed burned into my memory, following me no matter where I went. I tried to tell myself it was just the heat, the murkiness of the water playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had felt her. She was real. By dinner time, the camp buzzed with rumors. Word traveled fast, and by now, everyone had heard about the supposed ghost I'd seen in the lake. Some of the campers whispered about it over their plates of spaghetti, while the other counselors avoided me entirely. I caught snippets of their conversations, snide comments about me being attention-seeking or crazy. It didn't matter what I said. They had already made up their minds. That night, Logan called an emergency staff meeting. We gathered in the dining hall after the campers were sent to bed. The room felt stifling, the air thick with tension as Logan stood at the front, his arms crossed over his broad chest. I want to address what happened today, he began, his deep voice carrying easily over the hushed murmurs. First off, the missing camper was found safe and sound. There was no emergency. Secondly, he turned to look directly at me, his eyes like daggers. There are no ghosts in this lake. What happened was a distraction that could have endangered lives. We need to stay focused. This is the last I want to hear of it. His words hung in the air like a challenge. I wanted to speak up, to defend myself, but my throat felt tight. No one would believe me. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. And so, I stayed silent, my fists clenched under the table. After the meeting, as we filed out into the cool night air, one of the counselors, a guy named Jared, fell into step beside me. Jared was older, maybe in his early 20s, with an easygoing demeanor that made him well-liked by everyone. He hadn't said much during the meeting, but now he gave me a sideways glance. You really saw something out there, huh? He asked, his voice low. I hesitated, unsure if he was mocking me. Yeah, I said finally. I did. He nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. You know, he said, there's a story about this place. Something about the lake. It's probably nothing, but if you're interested, I could tell you. My heart quickened. What story? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jared shrugged. Just something I heard from one of the older counselors years ago. They said the lake's got a history. People seeing things, hearing things. Stuff that doesn't add up. Most of us just laugh it off, but he trailed off, his expression unreadable. What do you mean? I pressed. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced back at the dining hall, then lowered his voice further. Meet me by the boathouse after lights out. I'll tell you everything. Later that night, I found myself standing by the boathouse, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the lake. The camp had gone quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the warm summer breeze. The water lapped gently against the dock, its surface dark and impenetrable under the night sky. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting Logan to appear and chew me out for sneaking around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Jared knew something that might explain what I'd seen. Jared arrived a few minutes later, his flashlight beam bouncing across the ground as he approached. "You made it," he said with a small smile. He gestured for me to sit on the edge of the dock, and we both dangled our feet over the side, the wood creaking softly beneath us. "So," I said, my voice breaking the silence, "what's the story?" Jared took a deep breath, staring out at the lake. "This place has been around for decades, you know. Before it was a summer camp, it was a fishing lodge. And before that, well, let's just say the locals have always had their superstitions about this lake." "What kind of superstitions?" I asked, leaning closer. He glanced at me, his face serious now. "People say the lake doesn't like to give things back. You lose something in there, you don't get it back, at least not in the way you expect. And there's been disappearances, not just campers, fishermen, hikers, even a couple of the old lodge owners. All gone without a trace." I felt a chill crawl down my spine despite the warm night air. You think that's what I saw today? Someone who disappeared?" Jared shrugged. "I don't know, but there's more. A few years ago, an old counselor told me about Orphan Week. Said some of the kids didn't come back the way they were supposed to." "What do you mean?" I asked, my pulse quickening. He hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue. "The kids were supposed to be adopted by local families, right? But the records, they didn't always match up. Some kids weren't accounted for. And the ones who went missing, they were all from the orphanage." No one asked too many questions back then, but he trailed off, his eyes scanning the lake. "It makes you wonder, doesn't it?" My stomach turned. I thought of the pale hand, the lifeless face staring up at me from the depths. Could it have been one of them? One of the missing orphans? Jared's voice pulled me back. "Look, I'm not saying I believe in ghosts or curses or whatever, but this place, it's got a darkness to it. Always has. You saw something today. I don't think you're crazy, but if I were you, I'd stay far away from that lake." We sat in silence for a while, the water below us rippling faintly. I didn't tell Jared, but I already knew I couldn't stay away. Whatever was out there, I had to know the truth. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd barely slept. Jared's story replayed in my head on a loop, each detail pulling me further into a pit of unease. I couldn't stop thinking about the missing orphans, the lake's dark history, and most of all, the girl I had seen beneath the water. Who was she? And why had she seemed so real? Breakfast in the dining hall was no different from the previous evening. Whispers followed me wherever I went, and every glance in my direction felt heavy with judgment. Some of the campers were bold enough to approach me directly. "Hey, did you really see a ghost?" one boy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Before I could answer, his friend chimed in. "Bet he just freaked out and saw a fish or something." I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to me. "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, brushing past them. Deep down, I knew what I'd seen wasn't a trick of the light or a stray fish, but trying to convince anyone else of that was pointless. Logan cornered me after breakfast, his face as stern as ever. "Mike," he said, motioning for me to follow him into the staff office. Once inside, he shut the door and folded his arms across his chest. "We need to talk." I swallowed hard, bracing myself for another lecture. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, rubbing his temples like he was already tired of dealing with me. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you. Maybe you're stressed, maybe you're just a kid trying to get attention, but whatever this is, it stops now. I can't have my staff scaring campers with ghost stories, you understand?" "I wasn't trying to scare anyone," I said quickly. "I was just doing my job. I saw something in the water and I—" "Stop," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "I don't care what you think you saw. There was no girl in that lake. We searched it, top to bottom. Nothing. So either you made it up or your imagination got the better of you." I opened my mouth to argue, but his glare stopped me. "This is your last warning," he continued. "Keep your head down, do your job, and let this go. Or you're out of here." "Got it." I nodded reluctantly, biting back the words that threatened to spill out. "Got it," I mumbled. As I left the office, anger and frustration churned inside me. How could Logan dismiss what had happened so easily? And why was he so quick to shut me down? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like he was hiding something. But what? And why? The whispers in the dining hall, the orphanage's strange history, Jared's warnings, it all pointed to one thing. Something was wrong with this camp, and I was going to find out what. After my confrontation with Logan, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden, something bigger than just my supposed ghost story. The way he dismissed me, the way the counselors avoided the subject, even Jared's cryptic warning the night before. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't yet able to put together. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let it go. Not now. That afternoon, I found myself lingering near the boathouse, my eyes fixed on the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the cloudless sky above, but I couldn't look at it the same way anymore. It wasn't just a lake. It was a graveyard. And somewhere down there, beneath the murky surface, were secrets no one wanted to acknowledge. "Hey, Mike," a voice called, snapping me out of my thoughts. I turned to see Jared walking toward me, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "You doing okay?" I shrugged. "Not really," I admitted. "Logan chewed me out this morning. He said I need to let it go. But I can't stop thinking about what I saw, and what you told me." Jared leaned against the boathouse, crossing his arms. "Yeah, well, Logan's all about keeping things under control. Doesn't want any drama messing with his perfect camp. But I'll tell you this. There's more to this place than what they let on." "What do you mean?" I asked, lowering my voice. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, before leaning in closer. "A few years ago, there was a counselor here, Emily. She worked the waterfront, just like you. One night, during Orphan Week, she swore she saw something in the lake. Said it looked like a kid's face, just under the surface. She was freaked out, but when she told Logan, he shut her down, just like he's doing with you." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What happened to her?" Jared hesitated. "She quit before the summer was over. Said she couldn't handle the way Logan dismissed her. But before she left, she told me something I'll never forget. She said she'd heard whispers, voices, coming from the water. She thought the lake was trying to tell her something. Whispers, I echoed, my heart pounding. That word had come up before in the campfire stories, in the old rumors about the lake. And now it was starting to feel less like a story and more like the truth. Jared nodded. Yeah, and after what you told me about the girl you saw, well, I don't think it's a coincidence. The weight of his words pressed down on me, and I felt a growing sense of urgency. So what do we do? I asked. We can't just ignore this. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. If you're serious about finding out what's going on, meet me tonight. After lights out, we'll figure it out together. I nodded, my resolve hardening. Whatever was happening here, I wasn't going to turn a blind eye. Not anymore. That night, the camp was cloaked in silence, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustle of wind through the trees. I crept out of my cabin, careful not to wake my bunkmates, and made my way toward the boathouse. The air was thick and still, and every step seemed louder than it should have been. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the weatherwood of the dock and the glinting surface of the lake. Jared was already there, waiting for me with a small backpack slung over his shoulder. He nodded as I approached, his expression serious. You ready for this? He asked in a hushed tone. Ready as I'll ever be, I replied, though my stomach churned with unease. Jared pulled out a coiled rope and a small waterproof flashlight from his bag. We're going to check out the deeper part of the lake, he said. The area where you said you found the girl. If there's anything down there, we'll find it. I hesitated. The idea of going back into that water, especially at night, made my skin crawl. But I couldn't back out now. I nodded, swallowing my fear, and followed him to the edge of the dock. We tied the rope around the dock post for safety, and Jared handed me the flashlight. Stick close to me, he said. If you see anything at all, signal me. With that, we slipped into the water. The chill was immediate and shocking, even in the warm night air. The lake felt different at night, its surface eerily still, like a sheet of black glass. As we swam toward the deeper section, the light from the camp faded behind us, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to guide us. Jared dove first, disappearing beneath the surface. I took a deep breath and followed, my heart pounding in my chest. The murkiness of the water swallowed us whole, the flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, but revealing little more than suspended particles and swaying plants. The deeper we went, the colder it became, the water pressing against us like a living thing. Then I saw it, a shape vague and indistinct, floating just at the edge of my light. My pulse spiked as I swam closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was small, childlike, and utterly still. My hand reached out instinctively, but before I could touch it, Jared grabbed my arm and pulled me back. He pointed downward, and my stomach dropped. There were more, dozens of shapes, just barely visible in the murky depths, their forms tethered to the lakebed by long, frayed ropes. Some were skeletal, others bloated and decayed, their faces obscured by the water's haze. My mind raced as I struggled to process what I was seeing. These weren't just bodies. They were children, the orphans. I kicked for the surface, desperate for air, my heart hammering in terror. As I broke the surface, I gasped, the cold air filling my lungs. Jared surfaced beside me, his face pale and eyes wide. We have to get out of here, he said, his voice trembling. And that's when we heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the lake. Help us. It's been 20 years since that night at Camp Valleyway, and not a day goes by that I don't think about what we saw in the lake. Jared and I never told anyone, not Logan, not the other counselors, not the authorities. We didn't know how to explain it, and honestly, we didn't want to try. We were terrified of what would happen if we did. The thought of going back, of diving deeper into the nightmare we uncovered, was too much to bear. So we left it behind, or at least tried to. But some things don't stay buried. This morning, as I sat at my kitchen table sipping coffee, I came across a news article that stopped me cold. The headline read, "Skeletons discovered in drained Camp Valleyway Lake, linked to Clarkstown orphanage scandal." My hands shook as I clicked on the link, my mind racing back to that summer. The article described how renovations to the camp had required draining the lake, revealing what authorities initially thought were just old debris. But beneath the mud and silt, they found bones, 19 skeletons to be exact. All of them were children, their ages estimated to range from 6 to 10 years. Old! My stomach churned as I read further. The bodies were tied to anchors with rope, a crude but deliberate attempt to keep them submerged and hidden. The police investigation revealed a horrifying connection. The children were all orphans from Clarkstown, the same orphanage that sent kids to Camp Valleyway every summer. The adoptions that were supposed to give those kids a better life, they were fake, a cover-up for their disappearance. It didn't stop there. The orphanage had been pocketing state funds meant for the children for years, long after the kids were already gone. The camp, with its secluded location and deep, murky lake, had been their perfect dumping ground. No one had questioned it. No one had looked too closely. Until now. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. All these years, I had convinced myself that what I saw in that lake was a ghost, a hallucination, maybe even a product of my own overactive imagination. But the truth was far worse. Those children were real victims of unimaginable cruelty. And the girl I saw, the one who reached for me from the depths, she wasn't trying to scare me. She was trying to tell me the truth. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Should I come forward? Should I tell the police what I know, what I saw? A part of me wanted to stay silent, to bury the past just as the camp and the orphanage had buried those kids. But another part of me, the part that remembered her hollow eyes staring into mine, knew I couldn't. Not anymore. As I sat there, the coffee growing cold in my hands, I couldn't stop the flood of memories crashing over me. The girl's pale hand brushing against my face, the shadows beneath the water, and the whisper, "Asterisk, help us." Asterisk, it was all coming back now, sharper than it had ever been. For years, I'd convinced myself it was some bizarre hallucination, a trick of my mind born out of stress and exhaustion. But the article proved otherwise. I couldn't shake the guilt. I had known something was wrong. So had Jared. We had seen the bodies. Asterisk 19 children star. And what did we do? Nothing. We let the fear consume us. Let the camp's silence bury the truth. How many of those kids could have been identified earlier? How many families could have had closure if we'd spoken up? I read further into the article. The police had identified some of the victims through DNA testing, though the process was slow and incomplete. Most of the children were still unnamed. Their lives reduced to anonymous remains dredged up from the muddy depths. The Clarkstown orphanage had been shut down 10 years ago for unrelated charges of embezzlement and its staff scattered. But now, with the discovery of the skeletons, the state police were reopening the case. They were urging anyone with information to come forward. For the first time in 20 years, I considered it. But how could I explain what Jared and I saw without sounding insane? No one would believe me if I said I'd seen the bodies before they were found, alive one moment gone the next. Worse, if I told them about the whispers, the strange pull of the lake, or the girl who reached for me, I'd probably be dismissed as a crackpot. The thought of reliving it all in front of a room full of detectives made my skin crawl. I couldn't face it alone. My mind turned to Jared. We hadn't spoken in years. After that summer, he left Camp Valleyway and moved out of state, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and what we'd seen. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for a moment before scrolling through my contacts. His number was still there. My thumb hovered over the call button, doubt and fear gnawing at me. What if he didn't answer? Worse, what if he did, and he didn't want to? Revisit the past? Finally, I pressed the button. The phone rang, each tone dragging out longer than the last. Just as I was about to hang up, a voice crackled on the other end. Hello. Jared's voice was groggy, like I'd woken him up. Jared, it's Mike, I said, my voice shaking. We need to talk. Did you see the news? There was a long pause before he answered. Yeah, he said finally, his tone heavy. I saw it. We have to tell them. I said, my words rushing out before I could stop them. Everything. Another pause. Then Jared sighed. Meet me tomorrow, he said. We'll figure it out. The next morning, I met Jared at a small diner just off the highway. It had been years since I'd seen him, but the weight of the past was written all over his face. His once easy smile was gone, replaced by a grim, tired expression. We didn't exchange pleasantries. We didn't need to. The second we sat down, the air between us was thick with unspoken memories. So, he said, breaking the silence, you think we need to tell them? I nodded, my hands gripping the edge of the table. They found the bodies, Jared. Everything we saw, it was real. We can't keep this to ourselves anymore. Those kids deserve justice. He leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. Justice? You think telling them what we saw will help anything? They'll think we're insane, Mike. And even if they believe us, what difference does it make now? Those kids are gone. But they weren't gone when we saw them. I shot back, my voice rising slightly. They were still there. You know what we saw. You know what we heard. Don't pretend like you don't. Jared looked away, his jaw tightening. I never said I didn't. Believe it. I just don't know what good it'll do. Do you really want to stand in front of a bunch of cops and tell them we saw ghosts? That we heard voices coming from a lake? They'll laugh us out of the room. His words stung, because I knew he was right. No one would take us seriously. But the thought of staying silent, of letting those kids' stories remain buried, was unbearable. It's not about us, I said quietly. It's about them. Maybe the cops won't believe us, but what if something we say helps them figure out what happened? What if it helps identify one of those kids? Jared sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. You've been carrying this for 20 years, haven't you? He asked, his voice softer now. Every day. I admitted, and I know you have, too. We can't keep running from it. He was silent for a long time, staring down at his untouched coffee. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said. We'll tell them. But we stick to the facts, what we saw, what we heard. None of the other stuff. Let them figure out the rest. Relief washed over me, though it was tempered by the weight of what was to come. Thank you, I said. I know it won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do. We left the diner shortly after, the decision made but the dread still lingering. As we drove to the police station, I couldn't help but wonder what they would say, what they would think. Would they dismiss us as delusional, Or would they finally uncover the full truth about Camp Valleyway? As the station came into view, my heart pounded in my chest. This was it, the moment we would stop running and face what we'd tried to forget for so long. Walking into the police station felt like stepping into a courtroom where we were about to be judged for something we couldn't fully explain. Jared and I exchanged a glance as the automatic doors closed behind us, the air inside heavy and sterile. A receptionist greeted us with a polite but disinterested smile. "How can I help you?" she asked, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "We're here about the Camp Valleyway investigation," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We have information about the bodies they found in the lake." Her expression didn't change, but her fingers froze for just a moment before she nodded. "One moment," she said, picking up a phone and speaking in a hushed tone. A few minutes later, a plainclothes officer appeared, his face marked by a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Follow me," he said, motioning for us to come through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." We followed him down a narrow hallway to a small, windowless room. It smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the fluorescent lighting casting a cold, unforgiving glow. "Have a seat," the officer said, gesturing to the table in the center. He introduced himself as Detective Harris, then sat across from us, his pen poised over a notepad. "You said you have information about the Camp Valleyway case." I nodded, my palms damp with sweat. "We used to work there. I began," my voice wavering. "It was 20 years ago, during one of the summers the Clarkstown orphans were there." "Go on," Harris said, his tone neutral but watchful. I took a deep breath. "We were lifeguards. One day, during a swim session, I found something in the lake. A body. A girl. Maybe 8 or 9 years old. She was pale, cold, and lifeless. But before I could bring her to the surface, something pulled her back down." Harris's pen paused mid-scribble, his brow furrowing slightly. "Pulled her back down," he repeated. "Yes," I said firmly. "It wasn't just a current. It felt deliberate, like something was keeping her there." I tried to explain what I saw, but the camp director, Logan, shut me down, said it was a false alarm. "But I know what I saw." Jared chimed in, his voice steadier than mine. "That wasn't the only thing. Later that night, we went back to the lake to see if we could find anything. We dove down to the deeper part, and we saw them. Dozens of bodies, tied to the lakebed. Kids, some skeletal, others more intact. We panicked and left without telling anyone." Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You're saying you knew about the bodies 20 years ago and didn't report it." "We didn't know what to do," I admitted, shame washing over me. "We were just kids ourselves. But now that they've been found, we had to come forward. They deserve the truth." Harris was silent for a long moment, then stood. "Stay here. I need to speak with someone." As the door closed behind him, Jared and I sat in tense silence, the weight of our confession settling over us like a storm cloud. The room felt colder after Detective Harris left. Jared and I sat in silence, the faint hum of the fluorescent light above us the only sound. I could feel the weight of what we'd just said pressing down on my chest. 20 years of silence broken in a single conversation. But now, the waiting began. "What do you think they'll do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jared shook his head, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we couldn't keep this to ourselves anymore. It was the right thing to do." I nodded, though my stomach churned with doubt. What if they dismissed us as crackpots? Worse, what if they thought we were somehow involved? My mind spiraled, replaying every detail of that summer, every mistake, every missed opportunity to speak up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were too late, that justice for those kids had slipped through our fingers long ago. The door opened abruptly, jolting me from my thoughts. Detective Harris returned, accompanied by a second officer, a woman with a sharp gaze and an air of authority. She introduced herself as Detective Rowan, the lead investigator on the Camp Valleyway case. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes flicked between us, sizing us up. "We've reviewed your statement," she began, her tone firm but not unkind. "And we have some questions." Jared and I exchanged a nervous glance before nodding. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Rowan took a seat across from us, placing a file folder on the table. "You said you saw bodies in the lake," she said, flipping open the folder to reveal crime scene photos. "Do any of these images look familiar?" She spread out several photos of the skeletal remains found in the lake. The sight of them made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to look. The ropes, the anchors, the skeletal forms, they were all too familiar. My chest tightened as I pointed to one photo in particular. "That one," I said, my voice shaky. "The ropes. That's exactly what we saw." Rowan nodded, scribbling something in her notebook. "You also mentioned hearing whispers. Can you elaborate?" Jared hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It was a faint," he said finally. "But we both heard it. Voices coming from the lake. They were saying things like, 'Help us.'" It didn't make sense, but it was there. Rowan's pen stopped mid-note, and she exchanged a glance with Harris. "You're not the first people to mention that," she said, almost to herself. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. She closed the folder, her expression unreadable. "We've had reports from other witnesses, campers, former staff, who described hearing similar things near the lake. Most of them dismissed it as imagination or superstition. But now," she trailed off, her fingers tapping the table. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Whatever was in that lake, it wasn't just water and bones. And the more we uncovered, the darker it seemed to get. Detective Rowan's words hung in the air, heavier than anything I'd expected to hear. "Other witnesses?" Jared asked, his voice hushed. "You're saying other people heard the whispers too?" Rowan nodded slowly, her fingers laced together on the table. "Yes. Over the years, we've interviewed a handful of people connected to Camp Valleyway. Most didn't mention anything unusual, but a few, well, their stories align with yours. They talked about whispers, shadows in the water, and a feeling like they were being watched. It was enough to catch our attention, but without physical evidence. It was just that, stories." I exchanged a glance with Jared, the weight of our shared memory now even more unsettling. "What kind of physical evidence are you looking for?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Rowan leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Something to explain why those bodies were tied to anchors and left at the bottom of the lake. Something to prove who's responsible. But there's more. Some of the skeletons, they show signs of trauma. Blunt force injuries. Whoever did this, they weren't just hiding the bodies. They were making sure those kids wouldn't survive in the first place." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The orphans, the lake, the whispers, it all pointed to something darker than I could have ever imagined. "Do you think it was an orphanage?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Clarkstown." Rowan hesitated, her expression hardening. "The evidence points in that direction. The timing of the disappearances matches up with when the orphanage sent children to the camp, and records from Clarkstown were notoriously sloppy, conveniently so. It's possible someone at the orphanage orchestrated this, but the camp, it played a role too. Whether knowingly or not, it became part of their operation. Jared shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched tightly. But why? Why go to such lengths? Why not just, I don't know, abandon them if they didn't want them? Rowan shook her head, her voice somber. It's not that simple. Whoever did this wasn't just trying to get rid of the kids. They were profiting off their deaths. The orphanage continued collecting state funds for years after these children disappeared. The longer they stayed missing, the more money they could pocket. And with Camp Valleyway's remote location, the lake was the perfect place to cover their tracks. I felt a cold knot of anger twist in my gut. These weren't just random tragedies. They were planned, calculated. And for what? Greed? Convenience? The thought made me sick. Rowan broke the silence. We're doing everything we can to piece this together, but we're working with decades-old evidence. That's why your testimony is so important. It might not seem like much, but every detail brings us closer to understanding what happened. I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't feel brave or heroic. All I felt was the weight of what I'd seen and the realization that the lake had been holding these secrets for far too long. After the interview, Jared and I walked out of the police station in silence. The late afternoon sun felt out of place, its warmth and brightness clashing with the heaviness in my chest. I kept replaying what Detective Rowan had said. The whispers, the blunt force trauma, the calculated cruelty of whoever was responsible. It felt like a nightmare, but one we couldn't wake up from. As we reached Jared's truck, he broke the silence. Did you hear what she said back there? His voice was tight, his hands gripping the edge of the open door. The whispers, the injuries. Mike, this wasn't just people being greedy. There's something more to this. Something wrong. I nodded, unable to put my swirling thoughts into words. I've been thinking about it too, I admitted. The whispers weren't just random. They were calling for help, like they were trying to reach us. Jared looked at me, his eyes dark with unease. You think those kids, their spirits, or whatever's left of them, are still in the lake? Stuck there? The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't dismiss it. I don't know, I said honestly. But if they are, maybe. That's why we heard them. Maybe they wanted someone to find them. Jared shook his head, his jaw clenched. I don't know if I can handle thinking about that. The idea that they're trapped, that they've been there this whole time, waiting for someone to listen. We stood there for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. The lake wasn't just a crime scene. It was a tomb, a place where the lives of 19 children had been stolen and hidden, their stories buried beneath the murky water. Before we left, Jared glanced back at the police station. Do you think they'll find whoever did this? He asked quietly. I shrugged, the uncertainty gnawing at me. I don't know. It's been 20 years. Most of the people involved are probably gone or covered their tracks, so it'll be impossible to prove anything. But at least the truth is starting to come out. That's something. Jared didn't respond, but his expression softened slightly. For the first time in years, we weren't carrying the burden of silence alone. The investigators knew, and maybe, just maybe, they would be able to uncover what we couldn't. As we drove away, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. My thoughts drifted back to that summer, to the whispers and the pale hand reaching out to me from the depths. I couldn't explain it, But I felt a strange sense of peace knowing that those children's stories were finally being told. The lake, for all its horrors, couldn't keep its secrets forever. Still, as we passed the turnoff to Camp Valleyway, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake wasn't done with me yet. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle left scattered in the depths. And somehow, I knew the truth was darker than we ever imagined. A week after our meeting with the detectives, I found myself standing at the entrance to Camp Valleyway. The sign was weathered and faded, its once cheerful lettering barely legible. The camp had been shut down years ago, and nature had begun reclaiming the land. Weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt driveway, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was strange, standing there again after all these years. The place looked smaller, less imposing than it had in my memories, but it still carried that same oppressive weight I'd felt as a teenager. Jared had refused to come. "I've done my part," he'd said when I called him the night before. "I can't go back there, Mike. Not after everything we've been through." I understood his decision, but I also knew I couldn't stay away. The nightmares had returned. Vivid dreams of the girl in the lake, her pale hand reaching for me, her whisper echoing in my ears. Help us. I needed answers. I needed closure. The lake came into view as I walked down the overgrown trail, its once busy shoreline eerily silent. The water was gone, drained for the investigation, leaving behind a vast, cracked expanse of mud. The dock stood awkwardly in the empty basin, its weathered planks stretching out over nothing. It looked wrong, like a skeleton stripped of flesh. I stepped onto the dock, the wood creaking under my weight. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, the only sound apart from the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. I stared down into the muddy expanse, searching for, I didn't even know what, evidence? Closure? Forgiveness? The emptiness below seemed to mock me, a stark reminder of all the lives lost here. Then I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. My heart stopped. It was so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it, but as I held my breath and listened, it came again, clearer this time. Help us. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. The whisper wasn't coming from behind me or from the woods. It was coming from below, asterisk from the lakebed. Asterisk, my pulse quickened as I stepped closer to the edge of the dock, my eyes scanning the cracks in the mud. There was nothing visible but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just words. They were cries, desperate and pleading. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run as far as I could from this cursed place. But something rooted me to the spot. The same force that had drawn me here wouldn't let me go now. I had to know. I had to face whatever it was that waited for me in the remnants of the lake. Taking a deep breath, I stepped off the dock and onto the cracked mud below, the whispers guiding me deeper into the heart of the lakebed. The mud was soft beneath my feet, sucking at my shoes with each step as I made my way further into the lakebed. The cracks in the earth spiderwebbed around me, some wide enough to see the deep, wet sludge below. The whispers grew louder, no longer fleeting sounds carried by the wind. They surrounded me, overlapping and indistinct, like a crowd of voices just out of reach. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept moving forward, compelled by something I couldn't explain. As I reached the deepest part of the drained lake, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and I froze, scanning the barren landscape around me. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. I took a shaky breath and tried to steady my nerves. That's when I saw it. Something sticking out of the mud about 20 feet ahead. It looked like a small, weathered piece of wood, protruding at an odd angle. Curiosity and dread warred within me as I approached it. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a marker, like a crude, makeshift cross. My breath hitched as I knelt down, brushing the mud away with trembling hands. The wood was etched with faint scratches, letters carved hastily with something sharp. It took me a moment to make them out, but when I did, my blood ran cold. Ellie. The name set me reeling. Ellie had been one of the orphans during my first summer at Camp Valleyway. She was a quiet girl, small for her age with big, sad eyes. I remembered her waving from the back of a pickup truck at the end of the week, heading off with a local family who had supposedly adopted her. I'd never questioned it at the time, but now I felt sick. Had she ever left the camp at all? Or had she ended up here, like the others? The whispers returned, louder this time, more urgent. They seemed to come from all directions, pressing against me like invisible hands. I stumbled back, my eyes darting around the lakebed. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, shifting and moving in ways that didn't make sense. My chest tightened and panic clawed at the edges of my mind. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. She stood at the far end of the lakebed, her figure faint and shimmering like a heat mirage. Long dark hair clung to her face, her small frame barely visible against the gray sky. Her eyes, hollow, pleading, locked onto mine. I wanted to speak, to call out, but the words caught in my throat. She raised a hand, pointing toward something behind me. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. A fissure had opened in the mud, wide and jagged, revealing a dark void below. The whispers grew deafening, a chorus of voices crying out as a cold, damp wind rushed upward. The lake wasn't just a grave. It was something far worse. The fissure loomed before me, a jagged wound in the earth that seemed to pulse with its own eerie energy. The cold, damp wind rushing from its depths sent a shiver down my spine, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something metallic, like rust. The whispers surrounded me now, their tones shifting from pleading to something more commanding, as if they were urging me to act. My heart thundered in my chest as I stepped closer, peering into the darkness below. The fissure seemed impossibly deep, a chasm that swallowed the dim light of the overcast sky. The mud around it was slick and unstable, threatening to pull me down if I got too close. Still, I couldn't look away. Something about the darkness called to me, a pull I couldn't resist. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The figure of the girl, Ellie, was still there, her form flickering like a shadow caught between two worlds. She raised her hand again, pointing firmly at the fissure. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but the message was clear. She wanted me to go closer. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn, back, to run as far as I could from this cursed place. But guilt and curiosity rooted me to the spot. I had come this far, and something deep inside me told me that this fissure, this void, held the answers I'd been searching for. "Okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm here. What do you want me to do?" The wind from the fissure grew stronger, almost as if it had heard me. The whispers swirled around me, louder and more chaotic, yet still impossible to decipher. I crouched at the edge, gripping the muddy ground to keep from slipping, and shone my flashlight into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the void, revealing nothing but more darkness. I leaned forward, straining to see, when the light caught something, a glint of metal. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The object was buried deep in the mud, barely visible, but it was unmistakably man-made. It looked like the corner of a box, its surface rusted and worn. My fingers dug into the soft earth as I tried to pull it closer, the mud sucking at it as if reluctant to let go. Finally, with one last tug, the box came free. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and sealed tightly with a rusted latch. My hands trembled as I wiped away the mud, revealing more scratches on the metal. Letters, crudely carved like the marker I'd found earlier. This time, the words made my stomach twist. Property of Clarkstown Orphanage. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the lakebed into an unnatural silence. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the box, knowing without opening it that whatever was inside held the truth I had been seeking and the horror I had been dreading. I stared at the rusted box, my fingers trembling as they traced the jagged letters. Property of Clarkstown Orphanage. The weight of it was oppressive, as though the box itself carried the pain and suffering of the 19 children who had been silenced. The whispers were gone now, leaving a deafening silence in their place. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the lakebed were holding its breath, waiting for me to act. Swallowing hard, I pried at the rusted latch. It resisted at first, the metal corroded from years submerged in the mud, but with a groan, it finally gave way. The lid creaked open, revealing a collection of items inside, each one worse than the last. The first thing I saw was a bundle of small, waterlogged papers. As I carefully unfolded them, I realized they were adoption forms, or at least, they were meant to look like adoption forms. The signatures were all the same, shaky and identical, and the names of the supposed adopting families were obvious forgeries. My stomach churned. These weren't documents of hope. They were tools to cover up the disappearances. Beneath the papers were other items. Tiny, heartbreaking things. A child's bracelet, its beads spelling out the name Sarah. A pair of shoes, too small for anything but a toddler. A photo, faded and damaged, of a group of children standing in front of the orphanage. Their faces were smiling, but their eyes held something else entirely. Something that made my skin crawl. But it was the final item in the box that made my breath catch in my throat. Tucked at the bottom was a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover stained and warped. I opened it carefully, the damp pages sticking together, revealing neat, meticulous handwriting. The first page was a list of names. Ellie, Sarah, James, Daniel, and 15 more. I recognized some of them, names of children who had come to the camp during Orphan Week. The next pages were worse. They were detailed notes, plans, records of the children's arrivals and departures, and chillingly, accounts of what had happened to them. Phrases jumped out at me. Transported to lake, secured to anchor, asterisk no witnesses, asterisk my vision blurred as I realized what I was holding. This was a ledger, documenting the systematic murder of innocent children. My hands shook as I flipped to the final page. Scrawled in the same handwriting was a single, haunting line, asterisk the lake keeps its secrets, asterisk the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. The shadows around the fissure seemed to shift and writhe, and a cold wind rushed up from the depths, sending a wave of panic through me. I clutched the box to my chest and stumbled backward, my feet slipping in the mud. The voices grew deafening, a cacophony of cries that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Clutching the box, I scrambled back to the dock and ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my car, my hands shaking as I locked the doors. As I drove away, the lake faded into the distance, but the weight of what I'd uncovered stayed with me. The lake had kept its secrets for decades, but now I held the proof in my hands, and I knew the darkness wasn't finished with me yet. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lake, the fissure, and the notebook's chilling words. Asterisk, the lake keeps its secrets. Asterisk, the weight of the box on my passenger seat had been unbearable during the drive home. Its contents a constant reminder of the horrors hidden beneath Camp Valleyway's surface. Now, it sat on my kitchen table, a silent accuser, as I paced back and forth, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Turning it over to the police seemed like the obvious choice, but part of me hesitated. Would they believe me? Would they even take it seriously? The whispers, the shadows, the strange presence at the lake. None of that could be explained in a report. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The notebook alone could expose the full extent of what had happened. But another part of me felt like the lake wasn't done with me yet. The whispers still echoed in my mind, fragments of words I couldn't fully understand. The children's voices, pleading, crying, seemed to follow me, a constant reminder that their story wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. The lake wanted more. It wanted the truth to come out. I sat down at the table, staring at the box. My fingers hovered over the notebook, hesitating before flipping it open again. This time, I looked closer at the pages, trying to make sense of the scrawled notes and names. One entry caught my eye, marked with an asterisk, asterisk final transport, June 29, 1987. Confirmed disposal. Witness neutralized. Asterisk, my stomach twisted. Witness neutralized. What did that mean? Had someone seen what was happening and tried to stop it? And if so, what had become of them? The thought made my skin crawl. Whoever had orchestrated this nightmare had been meticulous, leaving no loose ends, except the lake itself. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my phone and dialed Detective Rowan's number, the one she'd given me after our interview. My hands shook as I waited for her to pick up, each ring dragging out longer than the last. Finally, she answered. "This is Detective Rowan." "It's Mike," I said, my voice trembling. I found something at the lake." There was a pause, then her tone shifted, sharp and focused. "What kind of something?" "A box," I said, glancing at it. "It has adoption, forms, personal items, and a notebook. It details everything, what they did, how they did it, the names of the kids, even dates." Her voice tightened. "Where are you now?" "At home," I replied. "I didn't know what to do, so I called you." "Stay there," she said firmly. "I'm coming over." As I hung up, a sense of relief washed over me. The weight of the box was no longer mine to bear alone. But as I sat there waiting for Rowan, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake wasn't done with me yet. Its secrets were out, but at what cost? Detective Rowan arrived within the hour, her car pulling into my driveway under the dim glow of my porch light. I watched from the window as she stepped out, her expression calm but focused. Clutching the box tightly, I opened the door before she even knocked. The weight of the night's events bore down on me as I handed her the evidence. "This is it," I said, my voice shaky. "Everything I found." She placed the box carefully on the table and opened it, her eyes scanning the contents with professional detachment. But when she reached the notebook, her expression changed. She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she absorbed the details. "This is damning," she muttered, almost to herself. "If this is legitimate, it could finally connect the orphanage to what happened at the camp." "It's legitimate," I said firmly. "I saw their names. Ellie was one of them. She's in that lake." Rowan looked up at me, her sharp gaze softening slightly. "You've done the right thing, Mike. This could make all the difference in bringing justice to those kids. But I have to ask, why didn't you come forward sooner?" I hesitated, guilt twisting in my chest. I was scared. We were just kids ourselves back then. Jared and I, we didn't know what to do. And honestly, I think we tried to convince ourselves it wasn't real. But now, I couldn't ignore it anymore. They deserve better. Rowan nodded, closing the notebook and placing it back in the box. "You're right. They do." As she prepared to leave, Rowan turned back to me. "You might have to testify," she said. "Be ready for that. The people responsible for this, they won't go down without a fight." "I understand," I said, though the thought of facing a courtroom made my stomach churn. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" she asked. "Make sure the world knows what happened to those kids," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion rising in my chest. "Don't let this get buried again." Rowan gave a small, reassuring nod. "I'll do everything I can. You have my word." As her car disappeared into the night, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in decades, I felt like the weight I'd been carrying was finally lifting. The children's voices had quieted, their cries no longer echoing. In my mind, I didn't know if it was closure or something else, but it felt like they'd been heard. I turned off the lights and headed to bed, exhausted but at peace. Still, as I lay there in the dark, a question lingered in my mind. Was it over? Or was the lake still holding secrets we'd yet to uncover? The truth about Camp Valleyway had finally come to light, but something deep inside me whispered that this wasn't the end. The lake had kept its secrets for decades, and while justice might be on its way, its darkness might never fully fade. The lake may have given up its secrets, but the darkness of Camp Valleyway still lingers. The whispers, the shadows, and the cries for help. Will we ever uncover the full truth, or are some secrets meant to stay buried? If this story gripped you as much as it still haunts me, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a chilling tale, and subscribe to RV Horror Stories for more true, spine-tingling stories. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next nightmare. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you found yourself standing at the edge of that lake? I'm dying to hear your thoughts.